they wanted us to write a story about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So I was like, it's a story, right? I can write what I want about it. Can we add some fictional elements? And they're like, yeah, you could do that. And so I was like, this is when I was in sixth grade. So I was like, oh, okay. So I wrote this whole story called Time Kill about a guy who made a time machine and sent someone back to the Declaration of Independence who had a silencer gun. And then he went and took out each individual members before they could sign the Declaration of Independence. And Benjamin Franklin got shot outside in the woods. He comes back in the time machine. It's this apocalyptic wasteland and robots are attacking him with bombs and so forth. And I drew a bunch of pictures for it. And I thought it was rad because I was like, this is way more interesting than just a bunch of white guys met in a room and then they said, oh, yes, good idea. And then they licked their quill pens. And then I turned it in and she sends me to the school psychiatrist.
If you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment about the episode. And if you're watching on Spotify or listening on a traditional podcast platform, please follow, rate us 5 stars, and leave a review if you would be so kind. Thank you. Welcome to the Way to Know You podcast, Season 3, Episode 36. My name is Nick Rounds, and I will be your host. My next guest is a writer, director, filmmaker, music video director, performer, vaudeville MC, spoken word artist, clown, slam poet, and the great-grandson of a cult leader. He's best known as the ringmaster of Oakland's underground vaudeville show, the Ruckus and Rumpus Revival, and also as an independent filmmaker in the San Francisco Bay Area. When he's not busy throwing pig hearts at an audience during a Valentine's Day show, more on that later, he's somehow finding time to sleep despite all of his amazing creative ventures. Jamie DeWolf, wait, I know you. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you. I love hearing that intro because it is all accurate and does sound pretty strange. But for me, it's at this point, it's very standardized and very normal. So yeah.
You live a crazy, tumultuous, busy, chaotic, wonderful, beautiful, creative life, and I don't think you'd have it any other way.
That's true. No. It does feel like a strange balance at this point. Like I have a clown performance that we're doing a week from now, and then I have like 2 video shoots before it, and I feel like it's a scale, and if things just lean too hard the other way, I start to just really feel off the rails. So if I go too much into serious film work, then it's awesome to have like a clown circus show or something like that to offset it. And then if you live in that land too long, then you start to become untethered to reality as well. So it's a good evening out.
Actually, let's start there. So the reason I know you and the reason I'm familiar with your work in the first place is because I originally went to Tourette's Without Regrets, which is now known as the Ruckus and Rumpus Revival. You're name-dropping clown stuff. I name-drop clown stuff in your intro as well. Can you talk about Fou Fou Ha and like what that is and what the clown troupe is specifically?
Yeah, so Fou Fou Ha is a psychedelic clown collective that started in the Bay Area. They since now have their own factions all over the United States. There's a Fou Fou New York and Fou Fou Austin and Fou Fou Portland and God knows where else they're going to jump up. And they're these pretty much like imagine Dr. Seuss characters leapt off the stage on ecstasy and are humping your leg with great psychedelic clown moves. And there's a lot of them and they're flying at the audience. And so I had seen them perform a couple times and was absolutely enraptured with them because even in the San Francisco strange arts world where there's a lot of wackos and whatnot, we kind of celebrate that here, but they still stood out because they're just like neon with these crazy wigs is not even a good thing to describe it. You should look up Fou Fou Ha and you'll see pictures of them all over the internet. And they would just run rampant at festivals and at different vaudeville shows, and they would just take over. You turn around and there'd be like 12 crazy psychedelic neon clowns just cavorting everywhere. And I'd had them perform at my show once and twice, and I said to one of the troop leaders, I said, "Dear God, what I would give to be one of you." And she heard that, and then later, it was like months later, she called me up and said, "We have this." Yep, that's exactly right. And I'm probably in some of those photos, and you'd never be able to recognize it. So it's yeah, yeah. So they were developing this new act that they were called the Man Shoes, where it was going to be all men, and it was this really deranged, wild, new choreographed act that she was doing that she wanted to premiere at a Pride festival. And so it was about 2 months of rehearsals of doing this insane clown strip group act. And the act went bananas and was this crazy hit. And we ended up doing it like all of these different shows. Like, I had no idea that we developed this one act, and then before we knew it, we were doing it at different festivals and did it like it had like almost a 6 month run of this crazy act of just ripping your clothes off and spraying silly string everywhere, and it's an amazing act. And over time, the act actually ended up getting adopted by some of the other Foo clowns and the other Foo factions. So now I've seen this act that we sort of created with the director, Mama Foo, that I've seen it now in New York, and we've seen it in Chicago, and it's just bananas. So, and people get moved in and out of the act. So there's so many Foos, it's crazy. And it's amazing what all of these clowns are like off in their day lives. You know what I mean? Some of them are therapists. Quite a few of them are therapists, actually, who like work with at-risk youth, and then on the weekends they just wild out.
I'm a little bit sad that the New York chapter is not called the Fu-Tang Clan. It seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I often introduce this as the Wu-Tang of weird. But we have done a lot of festivals. We did Electric Forest, where we did 2 shows a night for almost 2 weeks straight, and with crazy game show immersive stuffs. And so I've kind of evolved over time into being one of the main MCs for Fou Fou Ha, and it's big deranged fun. It's just awesome though, being just as a clown. There's so much history, and I talked to Mama Foo quite a bit about it herself, who's also a therapist in her day job, like a real legit therapist. And we talk a lot about how there's just such power in being clowns, and like the kind of history of clowns and what they're used for. And they are this sort of expression of id, and just like throwing off your shackles of everything that's repressive, and also just being so ridiculous that you're kind of celebrating all the absurdities of life. And even in a typical Fou Fou Ha like dance squad stuff, there's always moments. She'll get like some of the hottest dancers in the world, but there's always moments of weird clownish embarrassment, or you know what I mean, like bodily fluids, and like people are hot and then things get very awkward and strange and then go back to getting hot again, and there's been so many permutations of it. So yeah, but if you see them coming, you got to show up to it. We're actually performing at the Big Stick Shindig coming up, where we're going to be running our 24 karat gold show, which is this bizarre immersive game show dance cult where carrots are worshipped, and I come out with a big gold-plated carrot around my neck, and it's awesome.
Sounds amazing. You're touching on like the history of clowns and kind of like what they mean, I guess. Did you want to go deeper on that specifically? Because I'm just curious, since obviously when you become a clown, you seem to, go into clown culture a little bit more hardcore than you would normally.
Yeah, well, I heard something that is possible that it's a myth, and it's possibly true, but I love it anyways. And the idea is that the initial idea of the design of the clown, of the blood red lips and the pale face and the kind of strange discolored eyes, that a lot of that was a rendition of the Black Death, and was a rendition of what you look like when you were on your way to death. So you turn pale and you're coughing up blood, your eyes would sink back into your sockets. And so there's some speculation that a lot of the early clown design was in many ways like laughing at death. It was acknowledging the horror of the world and then spinning it on its head and kind of taking that sort of absurdity and transforming it into folly, into kind of laughing at it all. And throughout history, I mean, all of the pucks and the jesters of old time plays and so forth often were the only characters that could speak truth to power. And when you look back at the history of certain jesters, a lot of them had some really intense supreme power in certain Roman empires, and also a fair amount were executed. So some of them were
of course
tortured and decapitated in all kinds of not so merry manners. But there was always something to be said about that in terms of this outlet for comedy and this kind of outlandish character that could ridicule great characters of power. And so I think throughout history that clowning in general and vaudeville to a degree is really taking a lot of life's horror and flipping it on its head. Even pratfalls is that you're taking physical injury and battering and things that could hobble you, and you step and you fall and things get smashed in you, but you turn that into a joke. And so elements like that, and I think that clowning still does. I think it's why it's such an awesome outlet to just kind of have throughout life, and that whatever's going on. I remember when I joined Fou Fou Ha, I was going through this really horrifically just painful breakup. I was basically almost damn near going through like a mini divorce, and that was when I got asked to be in this Fou Fou Ha. So I would be like just suicidal coming into clown practice and then jumping around with bananas in our pants and throwing silly string and humping each other's heads. And you could just set aside your own personal suffering for a few minutes or a few hours and then come back to it. So I wrote a whole story about my whole initiation into kind of clownness and how that changed. And I would run from gigs that I was doing with Snap Judgment, where I was doing these really hard-hitting stories about teaching poetry in maximum security wings with juvenile detention facilities. And then I did a premiere performance of that story somewhere in the Midwest, and then flew the next day and was doing this big clown performance in front of a huge crowd, thousands of people at SF Pride on the steps of City Hall. And that is when it was really solidified to me of this is a good balance in life. You know what I mean? I wish more people had that ability. And I think that there's something to be said how we've lost that culturally. I think back in the day that was much more of a staple of certain cultures, where you'd have like the one day out of the year where just all rules were thrown to the side. Anybody could take over positions of power. You could celebrate. You could bang in the streets. Can you cuss on this podcast?
Oh yeah, please let it fly.
Okay. Yeah. You can fuck away in the streets. And there's sort of the one day though when the shackles of society were just thrown aside and people could just wild out. And I think we've lost that to a bit. Like that's been replaced by the Super Bowl. And you've had other holidays that have been completely just neutered, for lack of a better word, like your Easter celebrations and such, that used to be celebrations of fertility and pagan rites, and then just have been transformed into worshiping at the shrine of capitalism and chocolate eggs and so forth. And we've kind of distanced ourselves. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, though. That, I mean, it's healthy, it's necessary to have one day where it doesn't matter what your role, what your stature is, that you just throw that aside and everyone is able to just be a childlike jackass. You're also just able to embrace the kind of absurdity of it all. So, but yeah, there's a long history of it. It's kind of like taking your shadow and throwing face paint on it and letting it dance.
I was going to say probably my favorite holiday is my favorite San Francisco holiday specifically is Easter in Dolores
The
Park.
best. Yeah, it's the best. Even this year, when everyone's talking about San Francisco as a ghost town, which it kind of is on your regular workday, that Easter celebration was enormous with the hunky Jesus and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. And yeah, so, I mean, even in our Sweet Shit of Christ video, it's like we wanted to acknowledge some of those elements of how far some of these holidays have gotten from what they initially were. And I think that that's what's particularly frustrating is things that people find offensive. I think people from 1,000 years ago would look at our holidays as offensive because they're so far removed from their initial root and just far removed from their initial celebratory nature that I think were necessary as a societal pressure valve, you know?
Absolutely. And you name drops Sweet Shit of Christ.
Sweet Shit of Christ, yeah.
Which is
by the even bigger mouthful by the Bobby Joe Ebola and the Children McNuggets. Yeah, amazing band that Corbett and Dan, who I've done a bunch of projects with. And yeah, how would you describe the video?
I would describe it as typical of what I would expect from Bobby Joe Ebola, because the lyrics are so... You interpreted the lyrics in the way that I would expect to see them on screen, which is Corbett and Dan just let it fly and don't hold back whatsoever, and neither do you. So if anything, you two are a match made in heaven.
It was such a great video, partly because when they reached out to me and they said, we really think you'd be perfect to direct this. And I was like, okay, if we're gonna take on Christianity, like we got to take on all of it, like in 3 minutes. And so we had so many ideas for that, and I just had like pages full of concepts that we were coming up with together, and the amount that we were able to pull off on a like less than a shoestring of a budget. I don't know what's smaller than a shoestring, a dental floss budget. But I mean, we managed to get a whole pseudo church. We had a black Jesus marching down Broadway in downtown Oakland on Easter Sunday. We had an egging of Jesus on City Hall steps. We had we recreated Jonestown in someone's backyard. it was just awesome. I mean, also I grew up fanatically Christian. So anybody that gets offended with something like that is, I'm like, I think I'm allowed. Like I was passing out Bibles up until I was a freshman in high school. So it's like I was as devout as you could possibly get. So all this stuff is based on things that I know quite well and have like read quite a bit about. But I think that video is just also such a hilarious send up of everything. And it's just so much goddamn fun too. Stress on the goddamn, I guess. But yeah, we posted every Easter. You should check it out. Sweet Shit of Christ. It's super fun, just a wildly entertaining time. And just so many people came together for this madcap ride through the many hells of Christian hypocrisy and absurdity.
I love it. So speaking of music videos, just a general question, I guess. Music videos are really like a lost art, sadly, with from our generation.
I know, right?
It just makes me sad. Like some of my favorite music videos, like, you know, Michelle Gondry, Mark Romanek, Chris Cunningham. Like there's so many amazing videos and amazing directors that happened during the 90s and even early 2000s. But it's a lost art, sadly. What are some of the music videos that like really stick with you and most inspired you growing up?
Oh God, Lord. I mean, that's a great question. Boy, there's so many. I mean, that era, I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily filmmakers don't like connect your David Finchers of the world and your directors like that's what they were doing. They're directing these music videos. I mean, back in the day, the general path often to become a feature filmmaker was to direct a couple banging music videos that had a big old budget and prove yourself with that. And then that would lead to you being able to knock out some feature films. And I think these days, just the whole framework has really changed. I think with the decline of MTV and then the advent of YouTube being the dominant spot, it's even hard for a filmmaker in the same respects of music videos in the same way, because you often don't have record labels that have the same connection where like we're going to throw a bunch of money behind. Just the whole dynamic has changed. Back then you get signed to a label and then they get like $1 million to make a music video, and you can film shots of Slash from Guns N' Roses doing guitar solos in the middle of the desert, and you're filming off helicopters, and Axl Rose is like diving off of aircraft carriers, and like that's what they're doing. I mean, I think some of the videos that really influenced me when I was young some of them were just some pivotal dumb shit videos, like Janie's Got a Gun by Aerosmith, which was by David Fincher. God, so many Madonna videos, like a Prayer. That video's still so banging to me. Madonna dancing in front of flaming crucifixes. Jesus Christ. I mean, just as a young Christian lad, that was just like hormonal napalm, that kind of thing blowing up in my head. But I would say also that just growing up, 120 Minutes on MTV was every Sunday night, and it was at midnight. And I would stay up until midnight with my little VCR to try to tape every video that came out, because you see some of the most adventuresome filmmaking into so many techniques and designs all throughout. And I've actually wanted to dig around and grab those old VHS tapes just for the kind of inspiration. But there were some videos that really influenced me when I was younger. Even some of them are just so silly in terms of comparisons of the song. But I mean, a video like Jeremy by Pearl Jam, I love the abstraction of that. Metallica's Unforgiven video was so haunting, and it's like such a terrifying idea of this black and white of this guy dragging himself into this scary dark hole in all his writing, and just the visual language was so powerful back in the day. I haven't even seen many music videos, it feels like, these days, you know. Sometimes though, when I need to get kind of new inspiration, I will just go hunt for some of the old videos. I feel like a lot of new ones these days are just kind of get hastily thrown together. And when I work with bands, I often tell them that, like, look, I can film your band just performing, and like that's easy. I can do that, and I'm like, I don't think that that's particularly like challenging, and like I can totally do that. But is there something else that we can think of that it's more adventuresome, more exciting, and those are the things that I love to do because also music videos are your excuse to just do everything. You know what I mean? Like any
Right.
idea you have and to try to pull off. But of course, the problem is that we live with the visual language of music videos, and that stuff is hard to do on shoestring budgets. Your budget can fly pretty quick because someone looks at the latest Miley Cyrus video and they're like, I want that. And you're like, that cost $500,000. You know what I mean? So if you're trying to do something like that, we can come close, but it's like you don't have the same studios and the same like whole build of an entire set for everything. So
Yeah, I was going to say the only like modern artists that are actually doing something like really compelling to me is Billie Eilish and Travis Scott. Like the video for Sicko World is probably one of the most creative things I've seen in a long, long, long time. But yeah, I digress. So digging down more on influences and talking about you as a filmmaker specifically, I love that you're a dichotomy of somebody that creates poignant documentaries, but you're also about serious social issues, but you're also a filmmaker that loves to make movies about sex, drugs, and violence. So knowing that dichotomy, can you talk more about your cinematic influences and what artists have resonated with the most?
Yeah, sure. So I think when I was younger, I was definitely a kid of the 90s. And so some of the filmmakers that really stood out to me that were kind of like our leading lighthouses were the Coen brothers, Martin Scorsese, Stanley Kubrick, David Lynch. I've been on a whole David Lynch tear again recently and rewatched a lot of Twin Peaks and watched some of his earlier films as well, and Eraserhead and so forth. And
You were just in
David
the
Lynch,
Pacific Northwest, right?
yeah,
Recently?
I was. I just went on the Twin Peaks tour, which is friggin' amazing. And David Lynch still stands out to me, partly because my daughter got into David Lynch just recently, and that's sort of what reopened the door to me because she was like, "Oh, hey, I'm watching this Twin Peaks show. I've heard you talk about it." And I was like, "Wow, Twin Peaks, David Lynch." So I was talking about all of his filmography and like why that was significant. And even going back and explaining and talking about some of those films and getting her excited about it, it also just made me realize how rare that is to find these kinds of films in a movie theater these days. And just those kind of darker, twisted films that are more experimental are just so rare. They're so hard to find. And there's so many of the independent theaters that I've seen amazing movies at these days that are vanished. You know what I mean? And I saw some really pivotal movies to me in the time. I remember seeing Brick in the movie theater by Brian Johnson. Absolutely love that movie. City of Lost Children, seeing that on a movie theater screen. Lost Highway, things like that. I saw Kids on a movie screen. I think probably the most influential day, though, than in my entire cinematic genesis was I had a drama teacher that when I was a freshman in high school, he knew the kind of stuff that I loved to write, knew that I loved really dark humor and these kind of wild, spectacular scenes of crazy violence and comedy and so forth. And I guess he just knew me better than I knew myself. And he took me as a freshman in high school, sort of a day field trip, where he took me to see Reservoir Dogs in the movie theater, followed by Man Bites Dog in the movie
Oh,
theater the
wow.
same day. So it's some of the most darkest, twisted, violent films, both with dog in the title. Amazing coincidence. Everyone knows Reservoir Dogs, of course, but Man Bites Dog is a French film that was actually banned in some countries because it basically follows this philosophical serial killer around the movie. But I think that day and seeing Goodfellas when I was a kid was so influential to me in the movie Akira. Those are real touchstones, partly because it really just expanded my mind in terms of what was possible in not just following the kind of Hollywood path of these more prototypical film directors, the Spielbergs, the George Lucases, and so forth, or even the Hitchcocks per se. But I started realizing I really wanted to grab from different realms of film and also just films that celebrated something outside of the typical heroic motif. And I just was really drawn immediately to anti-heroes and to films that kind of have these morally gray areas and just really offbeat, strange senses of humor. And those kinds of mixture. I mean, I'm a huge fan of dark comedy. I don't think that there's enough of those in the world. I certainly have a dark sense of humor, but I also balance that with, I think, also incredibly hard edged, because they're true, kind of performances. And I think my entire career has been sort of leaping from those points of things that are absolutely relentlessly real to just having a laugh at some of the insanity and absurdity of it all. And so keeping that as a balance. But I think a lot of those were directors. I'm even just trying to like look up at my DVD shelf of like what stands out to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what are some of your favorite dark comedies and why?
Oh God, favorite dark comedies. Heathers is kind of criminally slept on. God, The Death of Stalin is so funny to me, and also especially if you know the history of the death of Stalin, like that shit is just 100% dead on accurate. Um, just let's see what else is some other dark comedies that come to life. God, I'm trying to look at my shelf right now.
I'm putting
Should
you on the
have had a
spot.
lot. Yeah, I should have had a lot of these more referenced. And
It's all good. I was just really curious.
yeah, I would come up with a list that I'll come up after that and see dark comedies that I love. Um, I don't know why I'm blanking on it right now. It's usually
It's all
a
good.
constant list in my head. Yeah,
We can
I hate
switch.
myself an hour from now when I don't recall 'em. Yeah,
One of my favorite dark comedies is Death to Smoochie. That's like a
Death
throwaway.
to Smoochie is awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, Goodfellas is damn near a dark comedy. There's so many funny scenes in it, and
The
the
Lobster.
Coen,
Yeah.
yeah, the Lobster is brilliant. I was dying laughing during The Lobster. Such an awkward film. A lot of the Coen brothers are amazing. David Lynch has really dark comedic moments as well. But yeah, I'm a big fan of kind of pitch black comedy like that. So
Love it. So shifting focus. So it took me going to your website and viewing some of your documentarian work to really realize and be impressed by like how deep you're going on like hard hitting issues. Like we're talking about like you pursuing like really serious topics like the diabetic crisis among indigenous people in the Navajo Nation,
mm-hmm.
torture in the region of Kashmir, and some of the most amazing community organizations around the San Francisco Bay Area, which those were all really fascinating watches. And, you know, I'm really glad that you made those. Can you talk about your documentarian work and how interacting with people and communities has changed you or impacted you as a person?
Yeah, for sure. So it was really kind of an interesting crossroads is how a lot of these projects come about, because they're all interwoven in organic and just strange ways, you know, as things happen. Is that so? Being as a poet performer and spoken word performer in the worlds of theater and slam poetry in that world, that led to a lot of performances in high schools, which also led to a lot of arts and education programs. And it was this almost kind of subversive back door that a lot of rappers, comedians, and poets have found, is because we are using language, and also we can be effective teachers and are good at public speaking and so forth. And so that led to a lot of performance writing workshops and different programs, and that led me to perform in prisons and do writing workshops with them and different writing workshops with youth. And I definitely have a vendetta to do that, if vendetta is the right word, partly because my own relationship with writers and creative writing classes through my high school and early years was I was often in trouble for my writing, and I often didn't have a good guidepost. I didn't have these programs. I didn't have someone that would reach out and say, look, you can say whatever you want in this writing workshop, and I want you to kind of to learn how to express yourself in a better way, and also just encouraging you to go whatever direction you want, even if you do have a dark sense of humor, or you want to rap, or you want to write a horror story, whatever, instead of just completely shutting it down right away, that you're celebrating the realm of expression versus trying to put your own societal censorship and kind of systemic control on it. But that involved kind of meeting a lot of other different artist educators and other activists and so forth. And so we would also, as I was working on different films, I would start documenting those programs. One of the very first documentaries I did was about a writing workshop, sort of a hip hop camp that we were doing in a group home. And then one of the nonprofits I was teaching with saw that, and then they said, "That's awesome. Can you go and do a documentary in this other program or doing it in another school?" And and then sometimes I'll get asked to do subjects that they know that I will go in and be as fearless as I can, even if I should be more afraid about it, and that I'll go that direction, and partly on some of my past work. So Here Still, which is the short documentary about torture in Kashmir, is that was definitely a searing experience. So I don't think I had any idea on how relentlessly awful it is over there and how these stories are just getting buried. I mean, it's super terrifying. And I mean, we knew enough about it going to Kashmir, but then when you're there and you're talking to people who have been blinded, people who are showing you all of their limbs that have been amputated because they've been tortured by the state, and you're talking to journalists who basically are saying they bombed a hospital and they were managed to take it off every headline. And a lot of the people that we interviewed, they ended up getting raided shortly after our interviews and so forth. So, I mean, it was about as dangerous as you could get. And I remember standing in the hotel that we were staying at, and we had to kind of move through the city pretending that we were just tourists. We didn't want people to acknowledge that we were filmmakers, because you didn't want to bring extra heat, especially to the people that we were interviewing. And I remember seeing a guy get snatched right off the street in front of me. There was a guy who was standing there, and this van pulled up with guys wearing military uniforms. They literally grabbed this guy, yanked him in a van. I was standing there smoking a cigarette, and this guy was gone in 30 seconds and less. He was just, and he was gone. He just tore away. Nobody said anything. Nobody did anything. And just to understand that there's so many scenarios like that and how integral it is to have movies that have these accounts, that have these stories, that tell this, that put this out there in the world. And so that video Here Still was also accompanied by an entire report that they actually delivered to the UN about all of the torture that was happening over there, that they were just flagrantly getting away with. And I mean, there were riots when we were there as well, so where there was just constant sense of impending darkness, that was these people are just getting consumed by it, and that their stories weren't being told. And so something like that was incredible to just be a part of. And it's just, when you get close to those stories, you're like, you almost feel like, how can I not film this, and to do everything I can to try to get these stories out. And that goes for, work with the people that I do kind of off screen, of families that have been ran through with Scientology and what my family has done to create that. And then also these other epidemics that are happening that we're all sort of complicit in, like the diabetes epidemic that's happening in Navajo Nation. And there's just, I'm not someone that is out there running in the streets trying to overwhelm myself with the horrors of the world, but I am a storyteller, and I know how important it is to have these stories told. You just realize when a lot of these stories are happening in front of you, or the more that you find out about them, is it needs someone to stand up, not just me, but I mean anybody. I mean, for these people to be seen, and you can understand the power of the media, whether it's an investigative story that comes out in a magazine or a paper or whatnot, just to get eyes on it, and also to preserve it so that you have evidence. And like, that's a really important factor of it as well. So I think that really all of the arts and the activism, to some degree, all kind of are interwoven in their own interesting way. And sometimes a lot of artists that I work with are also activists. So sometimes you don't see it in their art. And a lot of the people that I did those documentaries with are writers and performers. And one of the co-director of the Here Still, that's where she came from. And so she knew what was going on over there. And I was working with her on different films over here with youth education programs. And she said, look, I really want to tell this story over there, but I have to warn you, it could be dangerous. And I was like, dangerous? Let's go. And, but I that was an absolute learning lesson that I learned, to not have that same sense of hubris when you challenge totalitarian government states that make people vanish. And, that was a situation where I definitely felt like I was fleeing a dangerous situation. And I can only imagine the people over there, what they have to live with on a day-to-day basis. It's just a reminder of how important it is to get your art out in the world, to tell your stories. And those stories, whether it is investigative journalism or you're transforming that into art, still it's so important to get that out. And that goes for kind of everything that I do when it comes to the world of facts, is that just launching them into the world so that you get witness to it can have all these just ricochets. And even that video itself had all different kinds of impacts in terms of where it was seen and getting in newspapers and headlines and so forth, and causing a lot of conversation and debate and so forth. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. The Navajo Nation one as well. I mean, something as simple as soda can affect and rip through an entire community. And it's really funny to like how consumerism, or just knowing where products go and what they do to communities in general, like diving down on that. Like, I don't know if you ever had Tony's chocolate or whatever, but it's like on their actual wrapper, it talks about how there's slavery that's still involved in chocolate, which I didn't know about. And like little things, yeah, right. And so like little things like that, it's like, hey, I'm going to drop the fact that like just like a blood diamond, there's a story here that you need to know about, and mentioning the fact that in the year of 2023 there's still slavery involved with chocolate. It's like, oh my god, what the hell. So yeah,
it's like Method Man from the Wu-Tang Clan has a line where he says, behind every fortune there's a crime. And a lot of it comes down to the hard edge, black heart of money and economics and trade, and how these things happen, is that often somebody's profiting off it somehow, and someone is suffering because of it, whether it's putting god-awful food on our shelves just so you can keep it on the shelves longer, and you don't want to get the agricultural means to get to these people and these kinds of things, and then it'll just cause things like diabetes to ravage through these countries and so forth. So I mean, there's all these systems that we're a part of and that were pre-existing often before us, and we take part in them without even sometimes understanding how complicit it makes us. Whatever we're passive to, what we are not looking into, what we're consuming and what we're eating, and especially Americans in particular, are just, there's so much blood behind nearly all of our products and our houses and building, and literally the land we stand on. And I think it's really key, of course, for people to look into that, to understand how these things came about, and they're also to take ownership in what you're still complicit in. And that's a big factor of it. Yeah. But I mean, there's just large systems, and capitalism is sociopathic at its heart. And so if there's a dollar to be made, but it's going to destroy some sector of the populace, it's like often just evaluated in terms of, it's like cars, right? It's like, well, this car will kill so many people, but how many lawsuits could that lead to a year? And it's like, which is more? You know what I mean? And
seatbelts, who needs those? Apparently Ralph Nader needs to help us out there. But yeah.
Right.
No, I hear you on that one. I mean, so speaking of brutality, like I spent some time watching your short films as well, and some of the stuff is pretty violent. And I don't clutch my pearls and I don't flinch easy, but I will say the one thing that really strikes me the most about your filmmaking work and also your writing is that there's really strong truth in your writing, no matter how brutal it is. And I think that's a really unique quality that you have. So even when I feel uncomfortable or perturbed watching something that you've made, it still rings true to me, which I think is really unique. Can you talk about your writing process and how you pull stories and inspirations from the ether?
Yeah, well, I'm a big believer in the muses, and not because I believe in magical, mystical anything, but I believe that there's something that's gotten lost over time, where we've came to this idea of inspiration and this nebulous thing. But I think that the muses and ideas of just, you sort of have a radio wave in your head, and when you put yourself in the right zone for it, these things will filter in and come about. So I think a lot of it is just running after what's exciting to you and just seeing how far it carries you. And that's one. In terms of, I've had like two modes. It's like I have a hard edge mode, which is like, is this going to be about the truth as it is to me? Everything is subjective, of course, or is this going to be something that's fantastical? And it's either got to be hilarious or just absurd or the kind of story that I want to see. But a lot of them just sort of run into my head somehow. I feel like poems is very much like a sparring session, and poems, stories, writing like that. I think it's like you have to really just show up at the gym and just whether you're in the mood or not, and you have to just grit your teeth and get through it. And it's a big thing about showing up. I mean, I don't think that there's, when I talk about the muses, is that I'm saying is that you have to show up though. It's like the muses and these different ideas and concepts and things like that, they're around and they're floating, and sometimes they may just come to you in a blink, but you have to be receptive to it. And I think the receptive aspect is when you sit down with a blank piece of paper and you just start going, you know what I mean? That you have to just, I think it's like that old rule, if you have 100 bad poems in you and everyone has to get them out as soon as you can, that's a big factor of it. And there's certain ideas that just don't let go, you know, that have just jumped in my head, and I don't know why that I'm so obsessed with them as a story. And I still have a couple scripts that I just don't feel I'm like I feel oddly incomplete like until they're done, because they're just clawing in my head waiting to get out, and so once they're finally out, then that's something. But I think some of it is just these images and visions that flash into my head. When it comes to fiction, that's what that process is like for me. Is it's almost like you're chasing the white rabbit, leaping down the hole and not knowing where it's going to go, but trusting that it has some sort of destination, is following as much as you can go. And that to me is almost a different process, where I feel like I kind of go into a trance and I'm almost talking to myself and walking around in circles and sort of putting yourself in a state where you are showing and proving to the muses that you're open to the kind of whispers of the world and whatever that is. And I think that that's pretty common for a lot of people in a creative process. But when it comes to the writing itself, I think a lot of it is just about grit and sitting down and knuckling through it. And that so I guess I just sounded completely contradictory. So I think it's a mixture, right? I think it's a mixture of believing a bit in the magic of it. And I do believe in that. I believe that ideas are often bigger than you, and allowing them to just kind of come and filter through in some way. But also I believe in the grit and the discipline of you have to start writing before you feel inspired, and you have to just knuckle through it. And generally it's like the first 15 minutes are often the hardest. But if I can get past 15 minutes, then I'll write for like 2 hours and barely even notice where time went. I mean, a lot of it is the zone of it. And but I think a lot of it is just also just trying to follow what cracks you up or what's driving you, whether it's an obsessive need and so forth. And I think that there's a lot of fuel in our obsessions, right? I mean, you look at nerd culture, like all the action figures you have over there and all the books and nerd cultures that I have over here, and that I feel like the word nerd is often just a replacement for obsession. You know, if someone says like, I'm a big nerd on that, but there's just a certain power and fuel that comes to that when your brain gets so excited by something that it doesn't need sleep or food, or it's just like it gets this kind of zeroed in focus. And so I think that that's almost the holy state that we should try to be as receptive to as possible, because there's a magic strength that comes to it, and just different kinds of ideas that float through it. So I think some of the best writing is where you wake up the next day and you're not sure how that came about, or that you don't remember writing it, or it just sort of is speaking for yourself. I think when I have characters that start talking to each other, there's a certain point of magic where I feel like I'm just taking notes and they're like, you know, et cetera. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what I mean about the muses. I think if you have to get out of your own way, I have to get out of my own way, especially when I'm writing things that are even first person or confessional, and like try to set your ego to some degree to the side and run with it. And yeah,
yeah,
go right after this call. So yeah,
there you go. Good. Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, similar for me, like with photography, like you just have to like let it go and like let it be what it is. And I think that some of the best photos I've taken, when I look at them, it looks like I didn't actually take the photo. Like somebody else did. I'm just taking credit for it. I think the same thing can happen with writing as well, as when you write something that, I mean, you've written some amazing lines. I mean, your Snap Judgment video, the God and the Man, which is about your family's legacy. Like, you have some bangers in there, and you've had some bangers in all of your work and all of your slam poetry. I'm really impressed, not just you as a performer in general, but you just as a writer, and like how you're able to just like a hip hop artist, like one of the greatest MCs, you can drop like a single line phrase that'll just floor you. And I think that's one of the most impressive things about your writing to me, is that like you can pull out the bangers like that. So
thank you. Well, I definitely got schooled by all the poets that I came up with, where we would be obsessed endlessly over lines. And when I was in our trio, the Suicide Kings, and we would meet for rehearsal, and it was just constantly looking at rough drafts and just constantly dissecting lines. And that's also what I love about running a rap battle, and why we book comedians and poets and so forth, is that there is so much work that goes into how do you craft a perfect punchline, how does it land right, whether it's even just the right consonants or syllables, or like where you put it on. There's its own music to it of how that sounds. And I can look at drafts and just see things are just jumbled mess, and then sometimes it comes out cracking, and other times it's a big old mountain of mulch, and then you're just like, just banging away at it with the hacksaw. And I think some of the best pieces that I've written, like The God and the Man and Girl in the Hallway, those pieces for Snap Judgment, as a good example of kind of trying to get out of my own way, is that while those were incredibly personal pieces about experiences that I had gone through and were like kind of integral to how I have moved through life, whether it's like my family and so forth, or an incredibly traumatic event for an entire neighborhood and family and so forth of The Girl in the Hallway community at large, is both of them kind of came out in a rush. And I think that every time I had sat down and I tried to be like, okay, what am I trying to say here? And I need to almost like plan it out, like bullet points. It completely fell apart and just failed. And both of those came about when I was actually trying to write something else, and it was not working. And Snap Judgment, one of the producers, was like, why don't you go write that story about your family? And I was like, no, it's too complicated. It's too complex. And I think in almost just a fury, I was like, fine, I'll give it a shot. And I just almost wrote it on a damn near a napkin. And I managed to get out of my way long enough that an hour had passed, and it was already just moving, and had gone from these kind of overwhelming bullet points in my head, which were always going to be too complicated and sort of like to form into an essay, into something that was becoming much more of a visceral experience by just letting the muses kind of throw some fuel at you and motivating it forward. But yeah, we were always obsessed with every line, and that even if you're writing a story, is to have as many lines that kind of land and punch, even if you're not a rapper or a comedian. It's that same rhythm. And so having stuff that you can say on stage, but also could be on the page. And so it's definitely engineered a lot of our style in general. Probably because I have so many friends that can just rip a page apart when they look at your poem, and they'll be like, all right, I've heard this line a million times before, and, et cetera. And when you're around so many lyricists, like we all are kind of, that's like our little nerd crafting, is just like how you came up with a different kind of an image into crafting a different line. So, but thank you. Yeah, sometimes I will spend way too long on just one friggin' sentence to just be like, why is this just not working? And sometimes you'll even just put in a cliche because you're like, I don't know, this is going to be good someday. I hope I'm going to have to come back to it and just keep smashing it until it finally sounds right,
Yeah, no, I totally get that. So I kind of glazed over this. We kind of talked about it initially. We talked about the Ruckus and Rumpus like briefly, but we pivoted into Fou Fou Ha. So Ruckus and Rumpus is very special to me. It is probably one of my favorite shows that I've ever been to, favorite live shows I've ever been to. And I think it's such an important like fabric of not just the Bay Area in general, but specifically Oakland and the culture. So, can you give the audience the elevator pitch of what Ruckus and Rumpus is and why anybody that visits the Bay Area needs to go see the show?
Yeah, so it's a variety show that is almost a demolition derby of underground performance arts. So it has circus performers, burlesque, stand-up comedy, a dirty haiku bout, performance poets, aerialists, a freestyle rap battle, breakdancers, beatboxers, stand-up comedy. All of that happens within 3 hours, along with crazy audience interactive contests. And I swear it all somehow makes sense. And we just kind of call it the Wild West of just all these different arts. It's kind of a celebration of everything that you can do on a stage, all thrown together with this sort of outlaw, zany sensibility. And so it started in Vallejo, California, a long time ago, and it's just continued in Oakland. And Oakland is where it really, really blew up when I moved to Oakland, and it just became this resident sort of wonderland for weirdos in some respects. But it has been going on for over 20 years at this point. It's monthly. We've kept it going even through the pandemic, and it's just one of the best shows on earth, in my opinion, because when the energy is on fire and people are killing it, it's just the craziest energy you've ever felt. Partly because of the way the show is built, the way that the cast of the show, the crew, it just has such an exuberant, wild energy that's really, really rare. And it feels like Ruckus. And it just has so many different amazing performers that have been with the show from all over, that a lot of whom came just as an audience member or came as a performer on a sign up sheet, whether it's Jane the Message is a current freestyle champ, for instance. And I met her at some other random show. It was like I think it was a dating show. It was almost like a comedy dating show where they're going to send random people on a date. Anyways, it was another random, strange comedy thing. And, and I remember talking to her after, and she said that she rapped, and I was like, "Well, I run a freestyle battle." She's like, "Oh, I want to come to that," and so she came and then signed up for the battle, and now all these years later, it's like she's won so many freestyle battles and is ferocious and formidable while also being endlessly adorable, but is incredibly dangerous to go against because she's so fast on her feet, and one of many, many different kinds of performers that we've just met through kind of creating this open forum, because anybody can sign up for the battle, anybody can sign up for the slam. We do have a lottery for the slam and so forth, people on tour coming through. But I think a lot of it is just celebrating this renegade sensibility and making a spot where people can do their most outlandish work and that they feel like they can't do at other shows, that sort of thing. And it's just awesome. So, I mean, the pandemic, we lost our physical venue and we kept going throughout the plague and keeping it as a relentless pace. And that was sort of a sanity saving technique, I think, for all of us. And also was helping to pay artists, which is great. People are just performing in their living rooms and stripping off their clothes somewhere in Portland or in Texas, and all on some insane Zoom call with 500 people. And it was really amazing times, kind of kept us all as a lighthouse in a turbulent storm. And but now that we are doing shows outside, and looks like we're going to be moving back inside to a new home sometime later this year. So that will hopefully be the last of that chapter of the kind of plague pandemic years, and then on to the new one. So, but I think it's one of the best shows on earth, partly because I've been touring, for 20 years in the US. And I know for a fact there's not another show like it, because I would be wanting to tour at that show. That would be
Right.
like a perfect fit for me. And I think it's also, the show is put on by performers as well. So my stage manager is a comedian and a performance poet. Our other stage manager is a burlesque performer, and does circus performance and sideshows. So it's kind of put on by performers for performers, and we are very performer centric. And so I think also that's created, also as wild as the show can feel, is that the audience knows that the performers are in charge. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have we don't have like Oakland shit that happens at other shows of fights breaking out or things like that. I
Right.
mean, like it's very immersive with the crowd and so forth. I mean, what are some of the shows that you've seen? What do you remember from?
Well, I was going to say some of the most memorable shows that I've been to, in addition to just always being impressed and blown away by Syzygy every time I've
Mhm.
seen him live. I saw David Bory do a set one
Mhm.
time, and it was probably one of the funniest sets. It's actually online in one of your YouTube um, videos, which
Uh-huh.
I sometimes I go back and watch it because like I'm like, I can't believe that he killed that hard at that show. But like that's a lot of the
Yeah.
comedians that come onto your show, like to go to
Yeah.
your show. It's just like, how did you kill so hard
It's a
during your show?
super receptive crowd. I mean, I think when some people hear about it, poets, for instance, sometimes they get a little wary of it because of what they hear. Like they hear there's pig hearts or freestyle rap battles, and they think that no one's going to listen to their poem. But that's also why I lean towards performer centric. It's like the audience is quiet when people perform. They are really engaged and really listening. And partly because of the way the show is set up. It's structured that way. We have rules at the very start of the show, and it has a really awesome, joyous vibe. That's kind of where I come to this celebratory aspect. Like it's just such a fun show, partly because of the vibe that we are insisting on. I mean that this is celebratory and that we don't have hecklers that boo performers. I mean, if they're terrible, then then that's one thing.
Sure.
But I mean, we don't go that route. I guess it's when some people hear about the show, they think it's like beer bottles flying and people standing up and booing. I'm like, it's not that vibe at all. It's completely different. It's like if you're good and the audience wants you to be good, and they go fucking crazy. I mean, I have performers who have been from all over, circus performers and so forth. They say it's one of their best crowds to ever do a show at just because they're just so loud and engaged and really into it. So yeah, when you're a comedian and you kill it at Ruckus, it's like you really feel like you killed it. They're like, oh shit, that was awesome. Because they're all really listening, they're really into it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. One time I was there and Watsky showed up, and I didn't
Uh-huh.
realize that like he had history with you as
You did,
well.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, he used to be kind of an intern there and when he was young. I mean, we met him at You Speaks, so he was a rising young poet, performer, and MC through You Speaks, and then went off to college, and then moved to LA and became the Watsky, that everybody knows now. We had Jelly Donut, kind of made his name there, and Jelly Donut went on to become part of the Freestyle Love Supreme show on Broadway. Thesaurus, the uh, battle rap, the rap battler MC, battle rap MC. Lord. Anyways, good tripping on my own words. Clearly, I'm not a battle rap MC. Anyways, he started cutting a lot of his teeth at Tourette's back in the day, and ended up becoming one of the biggest rap battle champions like in the world, pretty much like right after. And so there's a lot of people that kind of use it as their home, their sort of renegade spot. Partly because we are also have been relentless. I mean, we have been once a month every year, rain, shine. I mean, just relentlessly marching forward through all the crazy things that Oakland has gone through, and even during the pandemic, just really keep charging ahead and doing it online. And then as soon as we could, we did an outside Renegade show, and 1,000 people showed up to an abandoned train station, and then we kept going and kept going, and and so forth. And so, I mean, the show's a lot larger than me and a lot larger than any one of us that kind of puts it on and so forth. And I I think it's our like part of the mutant fabric of Oakland now, I hope. So
no, I
it's
definitely agree. Yeah,
it's a lot of the Oakland that I see and a lot of the Oakland that I celebrate, and also just like Bay Area culture, and I think that's what a lot of people maybe don't know about the Bay Area, or at least a lot of its heart was at in the underground scene before it's been just dominated by tech, even though tech still kind of dominates. But I mean, there's a huge circus scene back here in the day. There's lots of different vaudeville performers that are here. There's an awesome underground hip hop scene that goes all the way back to hieroglyphics and so forth. And so there's a lot of these teaming worlds that don't often cross over. And I think that was always the purpose of something like Ruckus, probably because I love all those different arts and I'm often in one world or the other. And it's pretty rare to have some aerialist from Vaudeville Society, standing backstage with the latest battle rap champion. They often rarely cross paths in a performance context, but that's how quick our show is. It'll flip from one different kind of art form to another on purpose. I mean, it's purposely jumping from to celebrate one thing to the other and just kind of hitting you with bam, 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 bam. But it has a life of its own, which is awesome. So, I mean, there's people who reach out, who are working on acts, who are creating something, and they say, hey, my friend does this. They do something really strange. I remember one time someone hit me up and they're like, I know a guy that can balance and spin 2 basketballs on his penis. Do you think that that's something that you'd want to book? And I was like, is that possible? And 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 it is. And someone just showed me a picture of it the other day. It's one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life. And they're like a circus amazing genius. Like, this is an act that took like something like a year to perfect. This is a technician, right? This is not just some silly dude at a frat party. Like, this is a crazy skill that this guy got amazingly good at. It was just one of the strange, most audacious and amazing things I've ever seen. He goes from spinning all of these basketballs and just shit you will not see in Harlem Globetrotters. And yes, that is one of the end climaxes. And it's just like, but acts like that, where it's like someone reaches out to you and they get excited because they're like, I don't know where else I can do this act.
Right.
But there is a show, and the skies have parted, the heaven shines down upon us, where there is a place where we can do this. And yeah, we also have a very subversive sense of humor. So I think that that's a big part. But I think it's also that we celebrate comedy just as hard as we celebrate hard-hitting poems and hardcore shit and stories and things that are heartfelt and raw. So those are kind of always the worlds I straddle. And so I think a lot of it is in some of the stuff we've talked about before, and also why I probably sound like I have multiple personalities or something, is that to me has always been the arena that I've sort of let to back and forth, is like, very hardcore, raw, confessional, very truthful to the point of being sometimes painful poetry and raw theater. And that world was one world that I came from, but I also came from kind of wild, dark senses of humor and strange, hilarious, crazy films. And these things just always just kind of kept interweaving in my life. And I just always felt unbalanced if I just did one or the other. I mean, if I just did clown gigs for a month and I'm like, all right, let's lean a little here. Like, what's a story that I can tell that's something that needs to be said or I feel like isn't getting talked about enough? And so you kind of go back and forth. And I think it's definitely kept me sane for sure. I mean, I remember when that video about torture in Kashmir, when it was coming out, and there was a lot of investigations that got opened into us, and my partner was the government actually started an open investigation into me and my partner because of it. And there's a lot of scary shit I can't even go into that happened because of it. And I remember getting that phone call while I was literally hosting a clown game show in the middle of Electric Forest, and I was in full clown makeup. My partner was having to tell me that the Indian government was investigating us, and it was a good photograph of just those dichotomies, like in life, just one or the other. And I think there's a lot of folks that just don't understand at all how I keep those things balanced. And I guess I don't understand what it would be like not to, I mean, that lives without it just feel even more wretched to me. So I feel really lucky that I'm able to kind of facilitate. But it doesn't necessarily make employment easy when someone's trying to counterbalance these things in their head and they have no understanding. They're like, so what do you do? Are you a clown or are you a hard-hitting documentary guy? And I'm like, I'm both. But it's like, for those to coexist in some people's mind doesn't make any sense. To me, it's just a week, it's just days on a calendar of like clown day, film shoot, I mean, I'd go and teach writing workshops all day in a high school and then go host a circus show that night and then do a film show the next day, film shoot the next day. And so those kind of arenas and sort of keeping them all going and vibrant is probably the biggest challenge, I think, because that's a big part of it. I think that filmmaking in particular is a difficult thing to balance, just because it is so intensive. When you're working on a film, there's really not a lot of room for anything else. I mean, the schedules are super intense. When you're editing projects, it's very technical. A lot of filmmaking itself is so technical,
Yeah.
and so kind of keeping all those elements in your mind. But I think putting on a show and directing a film are very similar in terms of their skill sets, and I think it's hopefully why those are going to be sort of the dominant art forms at the end, is that I may get known for or have done the most of, is because they're synthesizing all of these different elements. I always felt as a writer that I just wasn't able to do enough. I mean, I just felt that if I'm just writing something, there's no music to it. I have to make it into a movie so I can get the musician and we can add music, or you're turning into something different. I mean, just writing by itself.
It's just one ingredient for the overall recipe.
Yeah, and I think that's actually, I guess, is a more honest answer when you ask about my writing process. A lot of times I also do need to have a motivation. I think that that's helpful. It's been really difficult for me to be one of those daily writers. I often need to be like, okay, what is the goal here? Whether it's a show that I'm going to be performing at, I'm like, okay, well, I've got a show in 2 weeks, so what am I going to do? Or it's the idea that it's just finally clawed its way out, and it's just like it's the time, or it's a vision of it. But I'm very end result oriented, and I have to balance that with also my belief that you do have to kind of be open to whatever it is and not just completely thrust your ego on it. If you're writing fiction and your characters don't do anything that surprises you, like, I think that that's a dangerous path to be on, because you might be missing some of the things that whatever's floating through the ether might pop into your head,
Absolutely. So. You touched on your volunteering work specifically. Can you talk about some of the outreach that you've done both at schools and prisons, and like what that work entails?
Yeah, so when I was a young hellion of a writer, I got in a lot of trouble for my writing, specifically in middle school, well, really pretty much every form of education. So, and a lot of times I thought that I was just trying to be imaginative, right? I would get an essay, and I'll give you one example. So they wanted us to write a story about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I was like, okay, so you want us to write a story about it? Like, we know what happened, and to my teachers, I was like, this is just an exercise. Like, you just want us to write it. No one's even interested in what we're about to say but I was like, it's a story, right? I can write what I want about it. Can we add some fictional elements? And they're like, yeah, you could do that. And so I was like, this is when I was in 6th grade. So I was like, oh, okay. So I wrote this whole story called Time Kill, about a guy who made a time machine and sent someone back to the Declaration of Independence who had a silencer gun, and then he went and took out each individual members before they could sign the Declaration of Independence. And Benjamin Franklin got shot outside in the woods, and because he wanted to change the course of American history. And then he comes back in the time machine. It's this apocalyptic wasteland, and robots are attacking him with bombs and so forth. And I drew a bunch of pictures for it, and I thought it was rad, because I was like, this is way more interesting to anybody, even if it's, crazy and cliched, perhaps, I don't know. But I mean, way more interesting than just a bunch of white guys met in a room and then they said, oh yes, good idea. And then they licked their quill pens. And then I turned it in, and she sends me to the school psychiatrist. You know what I mean? And so that's one example where I was like, I was just trying to do something more interesting, because I was like, I know how to write the other thing, but I'm like, who cares? They're not even interested in that story. I'm not interested in that story. Like, can I write it? Yes, but it's like, that wasn't the assignment. Anyways, but I thought I was very excited by sci-fi and horror stories and comic books. And so I was just like, if I have a chance to make something more damn entertaining, like, let's go with it. And yeah, they sent me to school shrink. So it was a lot of incidences like that when I got out of high school and I was performing a lot, and I started getting kicked out of open mics for my performances and such, because it was at Barnes and Noble, and they didn't like yelling about suicide at Barnes and Noble, and who knew? And so I started my own show as kind of revenge because no one could kick me out of that. And as I continued to perform, I would run into a lot of other performers who were also educators. And we'd also have teachers that would come to poetry slams because it has this veneer of poetry as a respectable, sort of quaint art form. And it would be like a wild teacher's night out, you know what I mean? Where they'd go and see some literary arts. And so they would come and meet us hellion crazy poets and they say, your set was awesome, can you come in and do a writing workshop or perform even for our students? And the first couple of times I did it, I felt it was almost like a dark joke. Like I felt like it was a trick and that I was getting revenge against the gods for all the trouble that I'd gone into. And so I almost came in like this was some sort of back door, like I was sneaking into the high school some way. I realized very quickly, though, that it was even more important for me to be there because of my experiences and as someone who got into so much trouble for high school. Because one, I'm not going to be the teacher that does that. When I see another kid who wants to write something that's super raw and confessional or wants to write the crazy imaginative story where Benjamin Franklin's getting chased down by some guy from the future with the silencer. Like, I'm not gonna be like, we need to send him to the shrink. I'm gonna say, hey, that's interesting. What else are you working on? You know what I mean? And then maybe refer them to some other authors they might want to check out, or encourage them to write in a different kind of genre, or like just encourage those writing versus just like throwing a wet blanket of control and sort of censorship on them and so forth, and kind of snuffing out a lot of those voices before they really become loud enough to be vibrant. And so the more high schools that we were performing at, I was doing a lot of them with Rupert, and I was performing at schools that we had gotten kicked out of. And so you can imagine what a crazy experience that was to come back there years later, and you're like performing in front of the entire school assembly. And so meeting kids, though, that you can see the same, self-mutilation scars peeking out of their sleeves and so forth, and they're looking to you not for like guidance, but I mean, even inspiration. Sometimes guidance, they might be direct questions and so forth, or help. And so you do your best. And I realized I wanted to be the kind of person that I did not have. And I know that how pivotal, how desperate I was to meet someone like that. I think when there's a lot of kids who are troubled and through all the hellish experiences you go through in high school, we're almost hungry and desperate to just find some examples, whether it's a musician or another artist that you read about or anybody to grab on, to get different models on different ways that you can escape, different ways that you can survive. And so that led to so many different high school performances where that ended up becoming one of our strange jobs in a degree. Like the Suicide Kings were touring high schools with a name as the Suicide Kings, leading entire school assemblies. And then that led to us doing writing workshops in juvies and writing workshops in San Quentin Penitentiary. And I still am constantly doing workshops. So I just led one at a mental health conference for media, multimedia, and social media. Basically, like when you want to turn your poem into a film, what are things that you should be thinking about along the way? So I don't think I ever even expected for a millisecond when I was the kid who was dropping acid and starting fights in high school that I would someday be a quote educator in any degree. And I'll tell you a secret a lot of people don't know and a lot of students don't know is a lot of your favorite educators were the most troubled kids in high school. And they become part of the education quote system because they understand how it can hurt children, how it can warp them. And so they're there to basically be a different guiding post. And so I think that that's always probably going to be some factor in my life as well, is working with high school youth in particular. I've worked with every age, so kindergartners to middle schoolers. High schools in particular, if I'm doing writing workshops, I think that's my favorite age, partly because their grasp of language and the experiences that they've gone through and are going through or about to go through, and just giving them that tool set so they're able to kind of craft that into language and tell their stories in a different way. But I just think it's so essential. I mean, you think about how many people go through high school where they're never giving you an assignment where anybody gives a fuck what you actually have to say. They're like, let me write an essay, but no one gives a shit. No one gives a shit what the essay is about. You don't. The teacher barely wants to read it. Whoever you're writing the essay on, Shakespeare doesn't give a fuck about your essay. Like no, you're just doing an essay. Like the exercise is to write an essay, but what you're writing, like no one's asking you really, like, what do you think? And so when you do writing workshops with these organizations and nonprofits like You Speaks and things like that, we have to tell them right away. It's one of the first rules. I'm like, I don't want you to write this for me. Like don't write this for your teacher. You're writing this for yourself. Like if you think it sucks, it probably sucks. Like don't write something that you think sucks. Like whatever that is, whether if you want to rap, if you want to write jokes, write jokes, you know what I mean? But there's just not enough people in high school who are telling kids in particular, like if you write rhymes, that could be its own career. People who write jokes, that's a whole career. If you want to write stories, if you want to write the crazy story about everyone at the Declaration of Independence getting assassinated to change the American history with your amazing story, the cover I had of it was so awesome. It was a silhouette with a lightning bolt going through it. I think I have it somewhere if my mom didn't burn it. Anyways, but I mean, those kids should be told like, hey, you should keep writing, you know, but maybe don't turn that in to your history teacher because she's going to send you, you're going to get in trouble. You know what I mean? But I think that we need those people to be there. And it's just so clear, especially with teen violence and school shootings and things like that. Like often I have to ask myself, like, did anybody reach out to any of these kids and like give them another outlet? Like how many artists are angry as fuck, you know what I mean? But took their wrath, their rage, their desperation, their everything they went through, and then they channel it into music or into writing or into painting or fucking dance or sport. You know what I mean? Like the only thing we celebrate is outlet. Yeah, the only thing we celebrate is sports, you know, in high schools, and
right,
this is the way it is.
I was going to say, so the point about the teachers being the people that the education system kind of failed, I think is really compelling. So I'm a game designer for video games specifically, and I had an opportunity. Thank you.
God bless you.
I'm here for your leisure as well. So there was a moment where myself, my friend Aaron, and a couple other people, part of Zynga, we started a game design program, like a video game design program for San Francisco schools, specifically Balboa High School and then Thurgood Marshall, where you've done work at both of those places.
Yeah.
And we were in a meeting with the superintendent from San Francisco, and he kind of dropped the age-old, well, I don't know if we want to promote video games because they're a waste of time, blah, 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 blah. You know, I don't know how parents are going to take this and whatever else. And so I kind of had my hero moment of like, hey, I am living proof that video games are not a waste of time. I've turned it into a career, and
right.
You know, it's heavily deals with math and science and everything else. And, you know, it's not a waste of time for kids at all. And there's something for everybody. So, yeah, I thought that,
sure.
Yeah, that point that you made is super important. So,
well, so it's just like when you challenge a guidance counselor, it's like, how did the guidance counselor become a guidance counselor? Like, was that what they wanted to do? Like, and they're in high school and so forth. And so many guidance counselors are obviously ill-equipped to explain different career paths that you realize when you're an artist or you're a filmmaker or any of these things, or a game designer or all that is like those adults that they don't know what those paths are because they don't know. Like they just don't know and they're ill-equipped and so forth. And so you have to kind of carve your own path. And yeah, I mean, Lord, like in the San Francisco area, it's like video game designers, illustrators, things like that. Like they can make a damn good living, you know? And they were absolutely nerds and geeks who are completely drawn to consuming the books and the comics and the movies and the stories and the video games. You know what I mean? Like that's the thing. That's why so many nerds rule the world in many different arenas, is because you know, we were like, you should go towards what excites you, because that's always going to, you know, that's the thing, is that is the driving fire and the passion. And the problem is that too many educators, they don't get it because they don't understand that as a passion that they approve. But like, fuck all that.
Yeah, you know? It's self-education and chasing after the things you're most passionate about versus just like being forced to learn about statistics against your will, even though you might be entering a field that doesn't need it at all. But yeah,
Right.
totally get it.
Right.
All right, Jamie. I could talk to you for another 3,000 hours, but I have one final question for you. And of course, I'm going to ask it at an hour and change into the interview, which is, you're the great grandson of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. I know it's a little late in the interview, but is there anything that you want to say about that?
He should have stuck to science fiction.
Well said.
Anything to say about it? Boy. Yeah, I would recommend, actually, when people are interested about the subject and they ask me about it, I would recommend to read The Barefaced Messiah, because it is the most jaw-dropping, craziest crime caper of a life you will have ever read, about one of the strangest con men of the century that is my great-grandfather. But the story of L. Ron Hubbard and what he actually did, who he really was, what the fuck they did in the 70s that leads all the way to now, like trying to topple governments, raiding every branch of the United States government, like just the insane, they were just running absolutely rogue wild as he's floating around on a ship, escaping all these jurisdictions, just attacking the world with this crazy cult army. The Barefaced Messiah by Russell Miller is a stunning work of investigative journalism. He had to walk through fire to get that book made, and suffer through a lot of danger to get those people to testify. But for anybody interested in true crime, anybody who's interested in wild stories of criminal rings and capers and con men, just read that alone, because anything I could say is, one, stay the fuck away from them, and they are a criminal organization that should be right off the planet, and because our taxes pay to support them, and I think that is loathsome. They're not a religion. They didn't start as a religion, and they started as a science, and so they should be treated like the fraudulent bullshit ass science that they are, and should be shut down for fraud. But past that, the story of L. Ron Hubbard himself is so fascinating, with what he was able to do by simply smashing his will all over the place and just lying his ass off. Even if you had a mountain of evidence in front of you that you could be holding right in front of him, just his endless addiction to lies is fascinating on its own. And he's certainly one of the more compelling con men of the last century. And so I think that's probably one of the most positive things I could say about it, is that it is a wild read. Do you know what I mean? I've gotten some of my family members who ask me who are also related to L. Ron Hubbard, but I mean, they ask me a few questions about this, that, because it's really viewed as poison in our family, and for good reason. And I've had so many experiences going against it toe to toe, with dealing with it out of the public eye. I mean, dealing with families, and there's a lot that I do that isn't public. And working with people who are trying to leave the cult, who have left the cult, all of that, and the damage that it continues to cause to families and how it destroys lives is horrifying, and just makes me so enraged that all of this has been exposed endlessly, and it still happens today. It's still happening right now. There's someone who's out there, thousands of people out there, who sold their soul on a physical paper contract for 1 billion years to my great-grandfather, who was long dead, laughing his ass off in some netherworld at all of the damage that everyone is still perpetuating his lies. And that's what endlessly enrages me. It's like, he did his hustle, and if you read his story, it's almost just his audacity on what he pulled. It's like he almost pulled off like the greatest heist of the last century with his life. But he's dead, and so the fact that the lie still keeps getting perpetuated is just makes me want to burn it all down. It's just like, all right, like, it's over. You know, this story should have been long over.
Yeah.
And the current co-leader, David Miscavige, has ran Scientology now longer than L. Ron Hubbard did, and that to me is just kind of a testament of like, when does this nightmare end? And I don't know. But I think that for all who are not necessarily wanting to maybe run to the front lines or damage their soul by diving too deeply down the dark abyss of Scientology, which I understand. But I highly recommend and read The Barefaced Messiah, partly because it's a book that Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard himself tried to stop endlessly. And it's amazing that it's out there and that it exists. But it is just so nuts, you know? I mean, I talked to my family members, and I just like, I don't think a lot of America even still understands how fucking crazy this organization is, that almost everybody knows who they are. They probably all walk past a version of it. And it's just the most nuts franchise that is still out there opening stores. They just opened another place in Ireland. You know what I mean? They're still out there, still banging, hoping that we will all just stop talking about them so they can just take their money and just persist for the next 1,000 years. But man, L. Ron Hubbard, heist of the century. What a fucking maniac. He was just like a pirate of people's minds, you know? And such a dark, malevolent guy as well, but also hilarious in his own way. I mean, just imagine Baron Munchausen mixed with Ted Bundy, you know, and then you get L. Ron Hubbard. Like, imagine Willy Wonka mixed with Hitler, and you get kind of close with like $1 billion budget. And imagine the Oompa Loompas were a quasi-military organization that basically work like the CIA, and you get close and then just sprinkle a whole bunch of sci-fi and brainwashing on top. And yeah, so I have like my own in and out sometimes. Me and my uncle were just talking about this the other day. It's like there's points that I can talk about it, and I can read about it, and I can work with, you know, family members and so forth and all that I've done. Then there's other times where it's like there might be like a month I'm like, I don't even want to hear that name, you know what I mean? Because it is such a dark magnet in my life. And it's always cracked me up when people are like, oh, you talk about the Scientology thing because, like, you know, you want the fame with it and whatever. And I'm like, no. I'm like, it's actually the darkest, most awful thing in our family history, the worst thing in the world for me to talk about. And my life is awesome otherwise. Like, being in circus and clowns and running rap battles and making movies and writing poems and performing, all of that is fantastic. Like, that is great, glorious artists. I mean, it's a hard life on its own, but it is not the endless abyss that this cult is. But I also feel an obligation. You know, if you're going to ask me about it, I'm going to smash on them. You know, there's never going to be a point that someone's going to ask me and it'd be like, next subject, no comment, whatever. Because I'm just endlessly enraged, and I'm like, we pay for them. And the fact that people are like, well, we gotta be respectful. I'm like, no, you don't. Like, they are absolutely will consume every inch that you give them and are just destroying families, and they should be gone. They should be completely disbanded and shut the fuck down. And they should have been a long time ago. And so it's just, there's nothing that make me happier than to see it collapse, you know? And Scientology will call us religious bigots, but I'm like, yo, read The Barefaced Messiah. Like, it all started with this one guy, and the more you know about this one guy and you see what he perpetuated, but the more you know about who he truly was, the more it'd be like, all right, this all came down to this one guy. That guy's dead. Game over. Let's stop the charade. You know what I mean? Like, he had his malicious, deranged fun being the Antichrist of the fucking 50s, you know what I mean? Like, it's over now, you know. Right. So
yeah, but that makes. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that, and there's some other great people like Tony Ortega, who runs a great blog where if people are actually kind of interested, he runs a great site called the Underground Bunker that literally almost every day smashes on Scientology. Like, I almost can't believe he's still alive. It's probably because he's so public about it. But I mean, every day. So people are kind of mildly interested in the subject. I'm like, read Barefaced Messiah, because you'll be like, holy shit. Like, you will be absolutely, I mean, you just can't make this shit up. You can't. It's like amazing that it's never been adapted. It's because people are so terrified of them. But read that, and then if people want to know what they're doing actively, you can find kind of daily updates on the Daily Bunker and There's another guy named Chris Shelton who's great, who also puts out a lot of different videos and such for people to check out. That's about the state of it now these days. But it's fucking endlessly crazy, and it's continuing, and we're paying for it. So
Yeah,
check it out.
in interviewing you, the one thing I wanted to make sure that I did is really illustrate and highlight everything that is amazing and positive in your life, and that you are more than the sum of your bloodline, and that you are a amazing creative person that staunchly rejects that part of your family history, and that you're not completely devoting your life to it, but you've devoted portions of your life, and smashing on Scientology is absolutely something that you won't flinch at. So, but
No, yeah,
again,
thank you. I mean, I just always I appreciate you even asking in that regard, because I've been so disheartened and brutally humbled, I would say, by how many people are just absolutely not interested in anything else that I've done. You know what I
well,
mean?
I mean,
And
I know you from the Ruckus and Rumpus, and
yeah,
that show is so special to me. And here, finding out about your family history through the Snap Judgment,
mhm,
the God and the Man, which, by the way, I'm going to link that, and please watch it.
mhm.
But you know, you're so much more multifaceted, and so much more. There's so much more to you than just your family history, which, frankly, doesn't really have a lot to do with you. It does and it doesn't. Like,
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't. But why I was saying the kind of being disheartened is because I don't think people miss the larger importance. Like, one of the reasons why my art in particular, like a lot of it is in two camps, and one of them is the sort of hard hitting truth, what I call like shit, like truth that's almost uncomfortably brutal or whatnot, is because of L. Ron Hubbard and his lies. Like I just felt as an early age, as I was like, I knew that I was going to be a writer, but I was like, I don't want to be, if I'm going to say something that I'm saying is the truth, I want it to be as raw and rough and truthful as it possibly can be. You know, I never wanted to be at the end of my life and then have someone accuse me of being a fucking liar in his writing or his work or so forth. And so, and a lot of what I do, even with Ruckus and Rumpus and my shows and working with youth and so forth, is really a reaction to that. Like I saw what happens when that kind of artistic energy goes down the most poisonous and toxic road possible. That instead of creating a show where we're celebrating individuality, he created a show that only celebrated him. You know what I mean? And is selling you the idea of your individuality, but is actually brainwashing you to him. You know, and that everything he said about his own life is a lie in order to perpetuate a myth so that he can get your money. And I hope that what I say about my life is sometimes humbling or pedestrian or whatnot, but it's like I want to be as honest and gritty as I possibly can, so that I don't know, so much of my life is a reaction to what he was, and to be what he wasn't. And so I think a lot of people miss that. You know what I mean? When I started my show, it was right around the time I was also really diving heavily into having conversations with my family about it, and seeing their own reactions, and how they've had to change and move their life in another way. And so I think that there is a sort of essential aspect to it, but I mean, the art aspect is the art itself is way more interesting than he is. You know, it's like
right.
he's just a reaction, as someone who would react to an abusive dad and then they never drink alcohol for the rest of their life because they are going to go the other road, you know, and that kind of thing. And so, um, anyways, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I think that I think Ruckus and Tourette's is, it's like I have created my own church. And I think when Ruckus is on fire, it feels like what church is supposed to feel like, where the whole community's there and you're fucking screaming and you're celebrating who you are, and people get up and they dance and they go wild and they showcase, and like a good show, it comes out, everyone's buzzing and kind of happy to be alive, and there's a lot of connections being made. And I think the cults are the opposite. You know, they use some of that energy and then they flip it on itself to control you and get your money. And so it's just a different choice.
And also, you're throwing pig hearts at the audience that sign up and paid
And
you
pig
money.
hearts.
They paid you money to go to
Yeah.
a Valentine's Day show.
It is amazing how memorable those are, and I learned that very quickly when I was like, this costs $3. Half of this audience ate bacon this week, but you throw a pig heart, and I'll hear about it 10 years later. People, and they won't even remember anything else in the show. It's a 3-hour show of circus performers, motherfuckers hanging from the ceiling, doing flips, and you throw meat though, and I was like, all right. I was like, well, memorable's good. We don't throw pig hearts every show, so
right. Just at the special ones. Yeah.
Just some special occasions here and there. You never know. You got to keep them on their toes, you know.
Amazing. Well, Jamie, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Before we take off, is there anything that you like to plug? Social media sites, cool things happen in your life? The floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So our show, the Ruckus and Rumpus Revival, still happens in Oakland, and hopefully will keep happening as long as we're alive and before the apocalypse. And so you can find that out if you follow the Ruckus and Rumpus Revival on any kind of social media, whatever. And we also put out videos on YouTube when we can. Get overwhelmed with a lot of media material. And my website is at jamiedewolf.com. You can watch a bunch of movies there. You can check out my feature film, Smoked, which is about a crazy cannabis club robbery in Oakland. That is a dark, violent comedy, if that is your cup of tea. And you can also pick up my CD, Vaudeville, on, I think, kind of anywhere, but Bandcamp and so forth. And support the arts.
I love it. All right, Jamie, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Nick. Have a great night. Thank you.
Everybody else, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And we'll catch you next time.